The Sound of Money with Santosh Sirur.
Hello and welcome to another super special episode of my podcast, The Sound of Money. It's quite hard to believe that we are almost there to the 100th episode. We've crossed 80 plus episodes, and thanks for being all through this wonderful journey, which I started way back in 2021. My guest on this show is a very special guest joining me in from Washington. He's Sriram Balasubramaniam. He's a US based author and economist. He's had 10 plus years of work experience, been an economist in IMF and the WBG group, the ecosystem. On this very special episode of this podcast, we talked to him on his new book, Thermonomics, and also about Kautilyanomics, which is a book for the modern times. Has got great appreciation and appreciation actually coming in from some very special people. We'll talk about that. Kautilyanomics was a bestseller, and even Thermonomics is already a category bestseller, and the only book where the Honorable Prime Minister Modi has written a letter of appreciation in the year 2024, literally on the last day of 2024. Sriram actually received this letter of appreciation. What a day to a day to end a year on. We could talk a lot more about that on this podcast. And even this book has received appreciation from a whole lot of people. And not just that, this book actually is, apart from the fact that, being a bestseller, it's also been mentioned about it in the Money Control and also the magazine, which is Swarajya, where the book has a lot of focus in terms of how India or Bharat has evolved over the years. We're going to talk all about that in this episode of that podcast. But first, let's welcome our guest. Hi, Sriram, and welcome to The Sound of Money.
Namaste. Thank you, Santosh. Great to be here. I've heard a lot about your podcast through common friends, and always a pleasure to engage with and discuss ideas with people like you. And thanks a lot for your kind words about the book and my research. I'm grateful, of course, to the Honorable Prime Minister for pleasantly surprising me on 31st December. But I guess it's the work, it's the message, it's a content which would have resonated with and continues to resonate with a lot of people. So I'm grateful for that.
Absolutely. A pleasure having you on this podcast, Sriram. Sriram, let's begin with the Prime Minister's appreciation letter, literally on the last day of the year. How was the feeling?
Well, it really, is. I'm still a bit speechless on this. I mean, to be honest, it actually went to my junk mail, so so I had to, luckily I because especially when these new emails come, you are often. But luckily, I was able to, look at it, and I was very grateful because, for someone like me who's been doing this, researching this for about 10 years, when I first started, say about 2014, 15, on the Arthashastra and the role of indigenous models and things like that. I mean, it was a sort of a primitive, I wouldn't say primitive, but it was an intrinsic passion. I mean, I didn't have a publisher, I didn't have anything at that time. It's just that I felt that this topic resonated with a lot of the indigenous cultural ideas that we had in the past and today as well, and it's really grown significantly. And I think this is sort of a testimony to the message in the book, and of course the importance that policymakers see. It is also very special because I think, like you mentioned, I think it was one of the first books it's the only book in 2024 that he has written a letter for. I was very grateful, and it's extremely motivating because, these are all, I think one important quality is persistence. These are all good signs for the work. And for the message in the books. And of course, I'm very grateful, and it was a very surreal feeling, I guess. And probably I'll keep that for the rest of my life. But it is indeed a very surreal feeling. Yes.
Yeah. So the Prime Minister actually mentions about Bharata and how you have delved into this world of work. And also the fact that India today is at a stage where the world is coming to India. couldn't have been a right time for a time to write a book on a basic Bharata's economy, the evolvement. Uh, what kind of a more appreciation have you received as a part of the book release all through in this year?
Yeah, I think it's been much more prevalent, because the thing is, when I started this series, so basically I had authored two books prior to this series, which were sort of self-published, one in the US and one in India. Which one was a
Yeah.
fiction novel, another was I used to be an international chess player, so something on the World Chess Championship as well. So in Kautilyanomics, it was sort of a fresh plate, but it gained a lot of audience by itself.
Yeah.
And then it gradually became a bestseller, as you mentioned. But for Dharmonomics, I mean, there was already an audience who knew the Kautilyanomics, who knew that a sequel is coming.
Yeah.
And there was a sort of an expectation, which is again a double-edged sword, but there's an expectation for this book. And then there's a fresh audience also that came, because of this. Because the thing is, in Kautilyanomics, I deal with basically Kautilya's Arthashastra.
Yeah.
And I derived this framework called Dharmic capitalism based on Kautilya's Arthashastra. And then Dharma is sort of defined sort of narrowly, but through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and institutions.
Yeah.
And then I map it, these ideas, basically I mentioned that these lead to three main pillars of Kautilya's thoughts. One is a rule enforcing but non-intrusive state, a strong state but that doesn't micromanage. Another is wealth creation via global outlook, basically engaging with the rest of the world in terms of maritime trade and things like that. And the last one is sustainable growth and welfare. The idea of sustainability being intrinsically part of Kautilya's thoughts. And then this structure is sort of mapped onto current contemporary ideas like trade, inequality, labor contracts.
Yeah.
And each of those chapters deal with what Kautilya's ideas were and how it's relevant today. So that's what Kautilyanomics did.
Yeah.
But it is primarily focused on the Arthashastra and its relevance, right?
Yeah.
But in Dharmonomics, it's a much wider ambit, because I talk about a lot of common era kingdoms, the Cholas, the Pallavas, Pandyas, Southeast Asian kingdoms, Cambodia, Vietnam, Java.
Yeah.
And my argument is a lot of these kingdoms had Dharma-based economic frameworks, with various iterations, of course. And that includes Kautilya's Dharmic capitalism, which I mentioned. And then the Dharmic ecosystem, which is the temple-based economies. And then, of course, Srini Dharma, which is the corporate guilds and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is this Dharmonomics has a much wider audience, purely because of the regions covered and things like that. And of course, people have been very kind. I mean, I met the Honorable Finance Minister and shared a copy, and she's very kind enough to give me some time. Similarly, the Honorable Education Minister also gave a very kind letter for the book. And in general, I think a lot of readers are captivated purely because, it's very difficult to get content, unfortunately, in Bharat, which is rigorous yet accessible to common people.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what I try to attempt in some of my research. And of course, I deal with some big research questions, which I'll probably share, in our further discussion.
Yeah. What is more interesting, Sriram, is when you have authors coming up with books on economics, they normally dwell into inflation and the GDP and the future forecast and all kind of typical economics. Now, what we see here, the book that you have come, or the books that you've come, dwell a lot into Bharata's economy, how it has evolved over the years, and that's a deep dive research, which is not as easy as you mentioned. Tell me what kind of, I would say, the kind of time that has taken to deep dive or double click into this research. As you rightly say, it's not easy to even find, the kind of works, because you're talking about history. How has been the journey for you all through the years to come up with these two books? And I believe it's a trilogy where you're going to even come with another book coming months, and I'm sure you will give us a peekaboo into it, but maybe take us through the journey.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, especially where you're based in Mumbai, a lot of my friends who are all in many of these banks, either as chief economist or lead economist. Their bread and butter is, of course, a lot of these macro indicators that you talk about, right?
Yeah.
Which is fair enough. I mean, that is the market cycle. You have to deal with these things. That's how the world engages.
Yeah.
But I think intrinsically people have to take a step back.
Mm.
The discussion, in my view, cannot be just narrowly siloed into either conventional Western metrics,
Yeah.
what we define as economic activity, and a set of parameters that defines this, and also this notion of the entire 1990 reforms. You have a set of reforms that were sort of there was a consensus on it, and then we implemented those reforms. Of course, we've seen so much benefit out of it.
Yeah.
And then we talk about second generation reforms, which is again great. But the entire Indian or Bharatiya economy of 1 billion odd people is much more complex than these narrow, confines that often not just economists but generally policymakers confine themselves to. And it's not really, I wouldn't, mention that it is particular to economics, but in general. But in the case of economics and economic policy, I think post-independent India, what often happened is that you had a bunch of people who were the elite post-independent India, and the elite, continued their elitism in various forms, which means they were basically privileged. So they went to the best institutes in the world. For example, the Princetons and Harvards and Columbias of the world in the 1970s. When, for example, my extended family was dealing with basic food and poverty. I mean, most aspirational middle-class Indians were dealing with that. But a lot of these people were privileged and they attended all these universities. They came back well enough with very good intentions. And then, post-independence till about 1990, we had a completely different system, which got us into the mess that all of us know.
True.
And then post the economic reforms, things changed. But what I'm trying to say is the 2024 of Bharat that we see today is a product of this aspirational class, middle class that we are talking about, right? Which went through a lot of poverty. The economic reforms gave them a base to sort of prosper. And then there's been a huge trajectory shift for this aspirational class. So the people who are in, say, my age group and above, which is probably, early 40s and above. Okay, I've not hit 40 yet, but their view of Bharat is very different because they come from their exposure to the world is different. Aspirations are different. And the way they view things are also different. So, I mean, long story short, what I'm trying to say is the perspective of looking at economic activity, looking at economics, I think itself, there has to be a thought process. So given this context, so this basically, coming to your question again, which is how long did it take and all that, I had to give you this primer because this is part of the story. So I chanced upon this because I was working on a data set by a late economist called Angus Maddison, who was a British economist. He basically wrote economic history for the last 1,000 years for the OECD. And basically, his summary was that India and China were the top two countries in terms of GDP and GDP per capita between 0 CE and till about 17th century CE. So this sort of fascinated me. But then I also felt that, look, there had to be some sort of a framework, some sort of a thinking behind all this, because I come from Tamil Nadu. And the plethora of temples and the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, which is a marvel by itself, an engineering marvel even today. There are so many of these engineering marvels that you see that is there during this period. So I really felt intuitively that, look, if people are capable of doing such things, which is very difficult to replicate even today, then they had to know much more than basic 101 economics. No, so I thought, there had to be a framework for this. So that my pursuit led me to that, led me to the Arthashastra, which provided a text, which gives you a context of all this. But again, it also leads to two pertinent questions. I mean, these are two sort of overarching research questions that drive my research. The first question is what I marginally dealt with, which is what is the indigenous Bharatiya model, economic model?
Yeah.
I think it's a very important question because if you take the West, I mean, if you take the Anglo-Saxon nations, if you take or any superpower, an aspirational superpower, let's take the United States, for example.
Yeah.
The entire modern day capitalism that we talk about today is at its root, philosophical root, and inspiration from the Protestant ethic from the French Revolution onwards, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, that's what drove a lot of the fundamental principles of what we define as modern day capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, the Chinese, their escape from poverty and things like that is also intrinsically some level, sort of decentralized to their Chinese model of governance, which is very democratic at the grassroots level, and they customize it to their local solutions.
True.
Similarly, for the Japanese, there's a reason why once you go into Japan, without Japanese, you cannot do anything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And a lot of their philosophies, whether it's books like Ikigai, for example, or other philosophies, they give you a sense that there's an intrinsic indigenous belt to their thinking.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is the Bharatiya, indigenous model?
The ethos there. Yeah.
Swadeshi is not, in my view, with all due respect, it's a political philosophy, right? It's not really an economic principle. Because if you really look at our past, we have continuously engaged throughout our past with the rest of the world. So this question was one research question that I generally deal with. The second one, which is more pertinent, is what is the role of cultural norms, narratives in economic decision making, right? So, for example, if you take even today, I mean, because this question deals with how is all this relevant today?
Yeah.
Right? Because if you really think about it, in Mumbai, just to give you an example, I think a couple of months back, Mukesh Ambani and Jensen Wong were talking in the Geo World Center.
Absolutely, yeah.
About AI and things like that.
Yeah.
Right? So at the part of the discussion, as Mukesh Ambani sort of was wrapping up, he was explaining in the discussion about the importance of Diwali, of how he starts new things, new projects in Diwali. Right?
Yeah.
The Mumbai stock market has more leaves and holidays aligned to the Indic calendar more than the British Gregorian calendar.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The entire sort of what I'm trying to say is at the individual level.
Yeah. The very base level. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of our economic choices, especially in what I call discretionary spending. Discretionary spending, just to cut the jargon, is say a non-essential spending. Yeah. Is largely linked to a lot of our cultural norms and narrative.
Absolutely.
For example, the UPI transactions in the last year, the maximum per week UPI transaction was just the week of Diwali.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in our case, a lot of our individual expenditures are all linked to the cultural cycle of the year. At the corporate level, example of Mr. Ambani himself and all other corporates, if you take the top 15 companies in Bharat today, right? Top 15 or 20 companies, even though they're listed, most of them are family-driven firms.
True.
They have some familial connection either at the governance level or systematically at the functioning level, right?
Yeah.
Which means what I'm trying to say is this cultural norms and narratives is a byproduct of thousands of years of experiment and existence, which I define as called a dharmic way of life over a period of time, right?
Yeah.
So it's an accumulation of all these things. So if you want to understand what is happening today in terms of how these entities make decisions, how their economic choices are made, and at the aggregate, how it affects the macroeconomy, one needs to be cognizant of where this came from. And that's where the indigenous sort of bent also is. So this is another research question, which I deal with in general. So, and my books sort of try to address these two overarching research questions. Anyway, so yeah.
So Sriram, it must not be an easy task, right? Getting into documentation, finding kind of right information, which probably, and you're really not going years back, you're going ages back in this kind of double clicking on the research. How challenging has it been? And did you have any mentors? Do you have any guys supporting you from India, because you're doing this research sitting out of Washington? And a lot of this information, for all you know, is not digital today. So did you need to travel to India? How was this whole process for you for both these books?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a matter of I would say persistence.
Yeah.
because look, everything is new, right?
Yeah.
On top of being new, you have a lot of pushback from conventional,
Yeah.
naysayers,
Correct.
uh, who like to, generally not encourage these things. But
Yeah.
that's a different story. Okay, I
Yeah.
have a thick skin, so leave that
Yeah.
aside. But looking at what I'm trying to say is, if you really look at the subject, right?
Yeah.
There are a couple of things. One, I work on this principle called triangulation of research, right? Which again is an important, I would say, structure with which I work, right?
Yeah.
The first part of this triangulation is data, right? So data, for example, an example is Madison's data set.
Yeah.
But we are talking about data thousands of years back, right? Even today, informal sector data in India is difficult to get a full number, right? Most of it are all estimates.
Yeah.
Of course, they are all refined estimates. But what I'm trying to say is, so one needs to be cognizant of the fact that you're going to get data, but the data itself is going to be, you have to take it with a pinch of salt.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, for example, in Madison's data set itself, I look at the trend line that you see in the data set, because he's having common benchmarks across countries and doing a comparative study across these benchmarks, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at the trend line, you can say that India and China were the, say, top countries during this time. But the absolute numbers are anyone's guess, in my view. Of course, you can have some estimates, but I still feel, for example, if you take the wealth in Padmanabha Swami temple, it's equivalent to the GDP of many countries today, right? Of course, wealth is a stock. But what I'm trying to say is, even how much of this has gone into the flow or is going into the flow for a particular year or range of years is a very difficult to estimate, in my view.
Yeah.
So one is you have data, but use the data as much as possible. That's one part of this. Two is what I call secondary research, right? Which means a lot of these inscriptions which are available, right? Especially in Kautilya's Arthashastra, I mean, the text itself is a translation. So that text is available. In the Common Era kingdoms, which I deal with in Cambodia and Vietnam, most of these, and in Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, there are lots of these inscriptions which are there. And most of them are digitized.
Okay.
So these inscriptions give you a sense of what these kings were doing. For example, it'll tell you this king, Rajaraja Chola, for example, gave this much money to this person at this interest rate during this day, this period of time. It'll be in poetic style, right?
Yeah.
But in essence, what one needs to do is get a consistent messaging out of all these inscriptions, right? Because eventually you want to, when you're drawing a framework, you have to go in and have consistent themes across. For example, the idea of Matsya Nyaya, that is avoiding Matsya Nyaya. This is a very important principle in the Arthashastra. Basically, in a very simple terms, it's avoiding a big fish eating a small fish, for example. Let's say a big corporate, running over a smaller business firm, right? Both in terms of competition, in terms of regulation, or whatever it is, right? So you want to avoid that. This is one theme that you find in across the chapters in the Arthashastra. You will find it in the legal chapter. You will find it in the, you can make an interpretation of inequality as well, reducing the gap between the rich and the poor through this principle. So what I'm trying to say is this theme is there in multiple areas in the text, right? So one needs to have the sort of, in a sense, sagacity and also sort of a big picture view to look at the thematic elements from all these secondary evidences, which is all these inscriptions, right? And the third part of it is what I call anecdotal evidence, which means during these times, for example, there are a lot of these traders, a lot of these Greek traders, for example, Jews, Chinese embassy, notes, Chinese travelers across the world were all in Bharat during this period of time, right? And they were all writing their own experiences. For example, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, there's a book called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which writes about a traveler's accounts in all these places in early Common Era period, right? Like a travelogue, right? So there are a lot of these anecdotal evidences which are there. So mind you, these are all third-party individuals who are involved, right? If the Cholas are involved in some economic activity between 2-3 people, there's a third-party guy who's observing this and writing all these anecdotal evidence, right? So most of my assessments are a combination of these three, which means the data is there. So I take some trends, some analysis from the data, supplement with the secondary evidence, which is based on the inscriptions, the thematic elements from the inscriptions, and then you have anecdotal evidence, right? which gives you again a broader, perspective of these things. So when all of these things match, that's when you make an assessment.
True.
Right? So this is a broad outlook of how I approach this research. But of course, I mean, it also requires travel. I've traveled to, for example, Cambodia. I spent two weeks there. I've been to a lot of these places in Tamil Nadu as well. But much of it is available online. I mean, a lot of the literature is available online.
Wonderful.
But it requires a lot of work because the amount of literature on the subject is limited, right? Because it's almost a fresh subject. Because unfortunately, historians and economists have not gone into such a basic thing for such a long period of time. So a lot of these ideas are fairly new, which I'm bringing to the table and trying to convince and trying to give a perspective. My point is not to say that what I am saying is the numero uno. I'm saying if you want to challenge it, please feel free to challenge it. I want 100 books like this. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
People shouldn't go through the process of really, going through this, not having material. Professor Balbi Sihag, who was a PhD from MIT, he had written a book on Kautilya's Arthashastra a couple of years before. But it is a very academic book where he argues that Kautilya is far ahead of Adam Smith, in a lot of these ideas. And besides that, very little. And Professor Satish Deodar from IIM Ahmedabad is another example who's done some work on this. So you're a sort of a lone rider. And this triangulation of research is what I do. And I, where possible, travel. And then do a lot of secondary research to assimilate a lot of this information. And then, pull together a lot of these strings. And then make a refined and a rigorous assessment of what these things are. And of course, this is one part of the story, landing a book and then sticking with the book and the pressures that come, that's a different story. Probably I'll
finding
answer
a researcher and even finding a publisher, I'm sure it's a different ball game altogether, especially for a book like this.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, I've already, for example, I used to write a lot, for a lot of mainstream publications in early 2010 onwards, for example, all the major newspapers in India I've written for. So I'm not a newbie to this writing game, for example, right? So even for me, I felt that there was a lot of pushback. I mean, pushback from, because first of all, I can understand in the sense that, okay, this is a fairly new topic, but, publishers, for example, wanted their own representations of how, they wanted to dilute the content. They wanted to, be very sort of diplomatic with the content and things like that, which I was not ready to do. Because I believe that this is what it says. And there needs to be no
right? You can't be
massaging about
sugarcoating it.
Yeah, and I wanted to, set the record straight and take things head on. In fact, so much so that I was, after about 3-4 years, I had already done the manuscript. It went through a couple of publishers, and I was almost ready to self-publish because I was not willing to, dilute
give up
the
on
content.
dilute. Absolutely.
Yeah, so because there are two things, right, in this type of research. One is the institutional pushback among, say, colleagues and economists and policymakers and things like that, right? For example, if you look, the late Vivek Debroy was one of my, was one of the people who really not just inspired me, but who also gave me a lot of early feedback on a lot of these things.
He even wrote the foreword, right, for Kautilyanomics?
Correct. So he had written a foreword for that. I mean, beautiful foreword. In fact, he's just been given the Padma Vibhushan. Sorry, Padma Bhushan, I think. Which is great. But he was one of the few people, for example, who would take interest in some of my work and sort of give feedback. But institutionally, there are a lot of people who either do not want to go from the conventional path to address some of these issues head on, or they're just not, they don't have neither the appetite nor the capacity to understand or want to understand some of these things, which is fine. So there are a lot of those type of pushbacks. And then, of course, there is the publishing, pushback, right? And that is, that was a difficult process by itself. And then I landed a publisher, and then the book started doing well. But I think eventually, I think my approach has been very simple, right? I mean, that if you really like something, if you're really passionate about something,
Yeah,
I think one has to just pursue it. I mean,
absolutely.
I think the focus is in the process, right? I mean, today you're saying very nice things about all these things, but which is good to hear.
Yeah,
But it's the process that matters, right? In the
true.
sense that even if no one is talking about this, I would still complete the third part of this series, the trilogy, right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
then try to get it out, because the process is something that I'm not just passionate about, but I think that's where the desire, the intrinsic desire to be persistent about these things comes through,
True.
because it is the process that matters. That gives you an intrinsic joy,
Mm,
and the outcome is just an outcome.
true.
Because I see a bigger purpose for this.
Mm,
Because it's a pity, because if you look at the West,
yeah.
um, a lot of thinkers have written a lot about this. I mean, about their own countries, for example.
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
George Akerlof I keep quoting him as an example. He was a former Nobel laureate in economics for asymmetric information in early 2000s, but his seminal work is on identity economics,
mm,
on the role of identities in Western societies and its importance in economics, the norms, narrative literature. There are folks from Stanford who talk a lot about this in Western societies, where it's fairly limited compared to us,
yeah.
right? But in Bharat, where it's still central or intrinsic to our economic choices, there's barely any literature. I mean, I've not even gone to the informal sector,
Yeah.
right?
Imagine. Yeah.
The informal sector today contributes to about even today contributes about 75 to 80% of employment in this country,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
And the informal sector is essentially driven by norms like trust, like these cultural norms in terms of financing, in terms of all these entities.
Yeah.
How governance structures happens in informal
Mm,
economy, right?
yeah.
I'm not sort of glorifying the informal sector,
Mm,
right?
mm,
I'm trying to say that, look, this is the reality in which you are in,
of
right?
course. Yeah.
So with that reality, there's no point sitting and trying to do things which are not aligned to this way of life.
Correct. Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is policy making should be aligned to the way of life,
Yeah.
which has
Yeah.
been a process of iteration for thousands of years,
Yeah.
and a social process, which is also emanating in corporate and economic lifestyles,
Yeah.
or economic ecosystems,
Yeah.
right?
Mm,
So if you need to understand this, you have to align policy to the way of life. I'll give you another example, right?
mm,
Let's take the Mahakumbh, for example,
yeah.
right? The Mahakumbh is happening now for the last 45 days
Mm,
in UP.
mm,
There are about 400 crore people
yep.
who are expected to attend the event,
Yeah.
right? It's not even I wouldn't even call it it is an event where all of them go to the Triveni Sangamam, and they want to have a snan,
Holy dip. Yeah.
spend some time there,
Yeah.
and then come back, right? But there are millions of people, right? The estimates, just to give you some context, from the UP government, I mean, the amount of investment made is about 7,000 crores.
Yeah.
The range between 7,000 to 15,000, but let's keep it around 7,000 crores, about 5,000 from the state,
Yeah.
about 2,000 as a grant from the center.
Yeah.
But the revenue estimates are almost like 2.5 lakh crores. Okay.
Huge.
The SGDP, the state GDP of Uttar Pradesh,
Yeah.
for 2023-2024 was 25.8 lakh crores.
Mm,
So the higher estimate is about 10% of the state's GDP,
yeah.
right? Let's say that, okay, the estimate is a higher estimate, okay?
Mm,
Let's even keep 5% of the state's GDP,
yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
Can you imagine a particular event
Yeah.
for 45 days
Yeah.
has such a massive impact on a
Absolutely.
state's exchequer over a period of time? Okay, the Mahakumbh is a selective event, but what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say is there are a lot of these individual events or
Yeah.
experiences of this dharmic way of life,
Yeah.
which emanate or which produce, economic outcomes,
Absolutely. Yeah.
directly and indirectly. So, for
Yeah.
example, in the Kumbh itself,
Mm,
there is a whole infrastructure that's built for the Kumbh,
true.
right? So you have people for the entire tourism infrastructure for people to stay, for people
Yeah.
to move from one place to another, and infrastructure, the roads, the bridges.
Yeah.
It's not even a tier 1 city.
Yeah.
So the entire, say, interface between the airport to this place. And after the Kumbh goes,
Yeah.
all this still remains.
It still remains. Yeah.
So it provides a lot of, economies of scale for the local population,
Yeah.
right? And this is there. If you take that, one of the arguments that I make in giving the context of the Cholas and the Pallavas and all these, where the temple as an economic institution was supreme at the village level. Because that's at the village level, besides its religious purpose, the ecosystem that the temple towns create,
Yeah, absolutely,
were driving economic activity in all these places in the past.
Yeah.
And it happens even today.
Yeah,
The support infrastructure and things like that. If you look at the decentralized model, this probably, if you really want to empower tier 2, tier 3 cities, targeting these economies of scale would be a wise idea.
Completely agree.
So what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of connection to the present as well.
Agree.
And the informal economy is also one part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my own experience, just last month, I happened to be in Mangaluru. There was not a single hotel room available. I mean, of course, it's vacation time, I understand. But a place like a tier 2 city like Mangaluru, which has so many temples around, and you can see the buzz around the temple area, right? From shopping to dining to probably everything is revolving around this town, and that's just one example. I'm sure that's the case with everything. And so temple economy has really added a lot of impetus, as you rightly say, in the development of the country.
See, another important point is, right, this entire demand that we're talking about is highly inelastic, right?
Yeah.
See, irrespective of what our GDP growth is, what the RBI's interest rates are, the next Mahakumbh will have 400 million people arriving at the Mahakumbh.
Anyways, right? Absolutely. Right? Yeah.
Even if you're a nation state or not, they will still arrive.
Correct. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is this Mangaluru example also you gave. Okay, instead of you spending in a 5-star hotel, you might spend in a 3-star hotel if there's a recession, right?
Yeah.
But you still spend on a hotel.
Absolutely.
Right? So from an economic standpoint, this is a highly inelastic demand, right?
Yeah.
Which is also, if you view it from a policy lens, assume that you assume that Uttar Pradesh is going through a very high recession or a heavy recession during this time. Okay. And the state government is looking for ways to stimulate demand.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So an event like this provides a great platform for a business. It's 400 million people in a stretch of 45 days.
Yeah.
Can you get a bigger base to promote your business?
Literally on the platter, right? When other countries are struggling for the growth. This is happening in a city of India, not even a state. Imagine.
Correct. Imagine having approximately 400 million people in a particular town, okay, over a period of 45 days.
Yeah.
Right? It's a time-bound thing. You have such time-bound demand, which is highly inelastic. So what I'm trying to say is this is a great opportunity it could be an opportunity to stimulate demand, both at the state level, at the business level, at the individual level.
Yeah.
Right? So these are avenues where some of these natural experiences that happen could be used as economic, the ecosystem that they create. The economic ecosystem that they create in the surrounding could be used as drivers of economic activity.
Agree.
And see, these instances that you provide are on a particular sort of event or particular occasion level, right?
Yeah.
But at the day-to-day level, there are a lot of choices that people make, are aligned. I'll give you another example, right? In Tamil Nadu, where I come from, in the month of Margazhi, that is between December, December 15th to January 15th, most of the households don't conduct weddings during the month of Margazhi. Okay. So the entire sort of wedding economy is silent during the month of Margazhi, more or less.
Yeah.
Right? During that month.
Yeah.
But there are similarly, so what I'm trying to say is a lot of these, this is an example, right? A personal event in the family. Most of them do not, do it during that particular month.
Correct.
So these are the choices, economic choices that, for example, the economic choices that we need to make in terms of investment, in terms of things related to a wedding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
is driven by a lot of these cultural norms and narratives,
Correct.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So these determine economic choices, not at the event level, but at the individual level,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
And similarly for entrepreneurs, probably that's something I can expand a bit more on the social capital, especially for local entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Because see, if you take a lot of the kirana shops that you have, in Mumbai, when you're walking around, you look at most of the kirana shops, right? If one of the shops say goes bankrupt, right? What is the first thing that the individual will do? Okay, the first thing, in my view, what the individual will do is they will look at their inner family, their familial network, someone in the family who's slightly more well off, is abroad, or is earning more money, will pitch in, try to sort of help this guy out in terms of financing, right? If that doesn't happen, what does that individual do? He'll go to a local money lender who might charge him some exorbitant rate, And okay, in some instances, if they have access to a bank and then there's credit history and things like that, banks will give you nominal rates, right? But what I'm trying to say is a lot of the financing that happens within a lot of these small and medium-based businesses, they're all driven by the local community's cultural norms and narratives, depending on that particular region. For example, in Tamil Nadu, there are a group of Chettiars, it's a business community, where for thousands of years they have, at the community level, they've been huge conglomerates of businesses. And then you have a lot of these community-based businesses as well, right? Where financing is done, financial architecture is done, and things like so. The entire informal sector, because see, informality again in an Indian Bharatiya context is again a tricky subject, because most of them can be digital but yet be informal.
True. Yeah.
Right.
The way we see it today. Yeah.
Correct. Like most of them are digital, right? I mean, they have their QR codes. Even if you go to a village, they have all that, right? But their governance structures might be still, following certain norms and narratives, right? So these are nuances that you see largely in the informal sector as well, right? And which provides a lot of employment. Similarly, in the formal sector also, you see that corporates, at least the leadership level, when they make a lot of decisions, these decisions are all linked to a lot of these norms and narratives. They might not explicitly flesh it out, right? Like how the West does it, which is what I am also, in a sense, attempting to do. Because this is explicitly an important concept that policymakers need to understand. If policymaking needs to be effective, right? So I mentioned earlier about how this idea of policymaking aligned to this way of life, right? Because the way of life is going to be the winner, right? Because it's a 1,000+ year or X number of years experiment,
done
experience.
And tested. Absolutely,
So they are not going to change just because a bunch of guys sitting in Delhi want to change them, right? If you institute a law, they might just bypass the law or do what they want to do. Okay.
Correct.
This is the brute reality, whether we want to accept it or not. But it would be wiser if people can understand what this way of life is and put policy in that particular way. So I'll give you another example. So this sovereign gold scheme, the RBI, now it's quite getting popular, but when it was, I think initially started in 2014-15, if I'm not sure. One of the things when they first started, it wasn't too successful. So they did a survey, I think one of the academic institutes, probably IMA, if I'm not wrong, or IMB. One of the top reasons why the scheme was not successful is, I mean, basically, in very simple terms, you have gold in your house, or an individual has gold. You take the gold, deposit, you buy a bond, say for 3-year maturity. At the end of the bond, they give you a new tranche of gold, right? Which includes the maturity amount. And you get back that gold. Okay, like a conventional how a bond maturity works. But in this particular case, what happens is the gold. I mean, one of the major reasons it didn't according to the survey was that Indian women wanted the same gold that they deposited to be given back to them at the end of the maturity. Right. The rest of the amount, the additional amount that's fine. They can have a new tranche of gold, but the material gold that they deposited, they wanted the same.
They want the same one back. The emotional value around it, right?
Correct, because it's not a, in conventional Western lingo, it's a
Yeah.
non-productive asset.
Yeah.
But from our emotional Indian Bharatiya context, it's a cultural asset.
True.
So people view it through a different prism, right?
Mm.
So I believe that they started tweaking the policy where, some of these things could be taken into account as well.
Mm.
Similarly, I mean, same thing with the Swachhata experiment.
Yeah.
Why Swachh Bharat is more effective in rural areas.
Yeah.
Is basically triggering this consciousness called Saucham, which is basically a dharmic idea. Where we clean in our houses, take the responsibility to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So much so that in a lot of these rural areas, now it's almost they feel it's their responsibility to keep their neighborhood clean. So these are, examples of where policy making, if it is aligned to this way of life, can make it far more effective. Instead of 70, 50, 75%, you can have 90, 95% of effectiveness.
Absolutely. In fact, when we spoke about, the Mahakumbh, today's Mahakumbh, the UPI, the digital landscape that we see in Mahakumbh, where transactions are literally happening at the click of a button. Not just that, there are so many of these supply delivery companies who are supplying within 8 minutes, to the sadhus who want a tea. A very famous South Indian coffee company has tied up, and it's been literally. So there's so much of digitization also now there on that space there. It's really adding up to the economy. So yeah. So
see, and look, what I'm trying to say is in a country as diverse, as complex, and as ancient as Bharat, I think it's important for us to take a step back from all this, because the problem is we are attuned to think that somehow the Western way, the Anglo-Saxon way of doing things is the only way to do things, right? It's a mental block. I think all of us have it, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the generation, post-independent generation, that is the people above 50.
Yeah.
I generally, I mean, I think it's a bit too judgmental, but I think that's a reality because that's the zone with which, for example, the generation, my father's generation, right, which is just post-independent, born just after independence, right? Their only goal in life was essentially to move away from the poverty cycle, right? Come what may, move ahead, and become a bit more prosperous than they are. At least get out of poverty,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Existential survival existence, right? So they didn't have time to think or even, worry about all these things. Their primary goal for first 40 years of their life is to do this, right?
Yes.
But we are at a stage where our income levels are rising. The basic sustenance is taken care, right? We are looking at, more premium things. And as a consequence, you're also looking more behind our past to understand ourselves more.
Correct.
Right? That's very important because, in a country as complex as ours, we should be open to sort of engaging not just the ideas from the West, whatever is relevant to us, but also our own indigenous ideas, because only these indigenous ideas or indigenous thought processes and the literature around it will help us deal with the situation in which we are now.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
The uniqueness, the customization of a lot of these ideas. I think one needs to be, not go to the other extreme and loathe the West completely.
Sure.
But take the positive ideas from the West, whatever that can be used for us. But yet have an understanding that, look, there are certain indigenous things which drive this nation. And one needs to be sympathetic. First, one needs to acknowledge it, to be sympathetic towards it, and perhaps do more research and try to align some of your principles towards it.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, let's get on to another different topic. You mentioned that you've been an international chess player. And chess is, today, if you are in India, chess is the buzzword thanks to the kind of victories we have achieved and been celebrating over the past few months. What's your take on Shatranj? And have you been playing Shatranj?
Yeah, I mean, I used to, just to give you context, I mean, Konaro Hampi, which is one rapid title.
Yeah.
So in the Asian Youth Championship in 2004, I mean, in fact, she was in the female section. I was in the male section.
Oh, wonderful.
But yeah, I played for international age group level chess. But yeah, chess at that time, I'm talking about at that time, meaning just 20 years back, was a different story altogether. I mean, we used to, in India, where we used to, it used to be much more less jazzy, less low profile.
Jazzy is the right word. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no chess-based India. There's no all that, and there was. I mean, there were computers, but they were. We had. You could count the GMs by the finger.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'm very passionate about the game. Of course, the thing with chess is, unfortunately, you know, at least in my time, now it's much younger, but
Mm.
by 18, if you're not a grandmaster, I think you just forget about the game. I mean,
Yeah.
in a sense, taking it as a profession at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Today, I think if you're by 14 or 15, not even nearing being a GM, you can look at other avenues, because that's how competitive it's become.
In fact,
But I
4 years old
think
is talking of being chess master, grandmasters, right? That's something which.
correct. But look, one major lesson that one needs to learn again from the chess revolution is it's the tipping point, right? I mean, there was a generation before
Hmm.
these young kids.
Yeah.
So there was Anand, and before Anand was Manuel Aaron, but that generation, and then Anand had a breakthrough where he was became the first grandmaster.
Hmm.
And then post Anand, there was again a time where you
Took
know
some time to, yeah. Hmm.
people came through,
Yeah.
and then a lot of these youngsters were also nurtured at that time.
Hmm.
But then in the post 2010, that's when the group of guys really
Yeah.
it really assimilated. And of course, post the pandemic, I think the entire digital revolution, and how it really made the game popular. So much so that these guys are now world beaters. I mean, so it's an amazing thing. In fact, the current world champion Gukesh, his dad was kind enough to connect with me, and he has a copy of my
Okay.
book. He's a very, very, very enterprising and very humble, very matured for his age.
Yeah.
And amazing parents as well. Because see, it's a massive sacrifice, right? Because unlike in general sports, you have to peak at the right time.
Hmm.
Within those, say, 20 to 30 age group, you have to be at your best for you to be
Yeah.
a beater. In
Yeah.
chess, it's even worse, because you have to start when you're 6 or 7,
Yeah.
and peak by at least 16 or 17,
Yeah.
right? You've not even crossed your teenage age.
Yeah.
So it's a whole leap of trust that parents have to put
Correct.
over these kids,
Yeah.
to really throw all the financial and the personal might
Yeah.
behind them.
Yeah.
In fact, my chess book, which I referred to,
Hmm.
was an interesting book which I wrote with a Norwegian. It was on the Anand Carlsen World Championship,
Okay.
which happened in Chennai in
Hmm.
2013.
Hmm.
So Arne Danielsen, he was a Norwegian journalist who knew Carlsen very well.
Hmm.
So we got in touch somehow, and I was doing a lot of writing, so we decided to write a book. So it's a chess book, but it doesn't talk about chess moves. It talks about their lives. So we interview people behind,
Oh, wonderful.
how they made themselves world champions and things like that.
Hmm.
I mean, it had a soft launch in the US. It's published in the US, not yet in India though.
Hmm.
Probably this chess boom is an avenue for it to
It's a
get
good
it in
time to be,
India.
yeah, of course. Yeah. Really think about
But
it.
yeah, it's very nice to see the rise of Indian chess. But
Wonderful.
yeah.
Wonderful. So, Sriram, sitting out of Washington, how is the kind of feedback? I'm sure it's very positive from the Americans about India. How is the Bharat story catching up there from a US lens, and more so with the change in world order, if I have to put it, with Trump coming in? How do you see the future of Bharat from a US lens?
I think in general, I think there's among the bipartisan consensus among Democrats and Republicans,
Hmm.
there's very few
Yeah.
bipartisan consensus. I think one of the things is the anti-China sentiment.
Yeah.
And another thing is the pro-India sentiment. So I think irrespective of who's in power, purely because of the economic equation, the financial equation, and also the political equation, India's presence it becomes very important. So it's
Yeah.
not surprising that Dr. Jaishankar was in the first row,
Yeah. Absolutely.
during it's not at all surprising. But again, I think so. In general, I think we have a sweet spot about 5 to 10 years.
Hmm.
Because the moment we become China, then we will be at the receiving end of that, right? As of now, we are seeing as an ally who can counter the Chinese rise. right?
Absolutely.
So I think we're in a sweet spot, and and we have stable leadership. We're a democratic country. We have democratic values. So a lot of the value alignment happens, and in that sense, it's good. So I think there is a general consensus about about India's positive thinking about how India is, and of course, Honorable Prime Minister's leadership,
Yeah.
and his global persona. I mean,
Mm.
he's a global icon now. So,
Right.
um, just to give you some context, right? 2014, if you had told me for International Yoga Day, who would come and bother about it in these circles, I wouldn't have bet much.
Absolutely.
Today, you know, the MD of all these major institutions are all doing yoga on Yoga Day, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So I think, of course, it has to do with our past and the benefits of yoga, which is a different story.
Mm.
But Prime Minister Modi's presence is something that I think one needs to definitely acknowledge, and I think it's taken India's story much more in a positive way.
Absolutely.
But of course, the Trump era is as uncertain, and I think there needs to be a lot of navigation. But I think this time around, probably India needs to be a bit more cautious, I guess, because the Chinese threat could be nullified by the presence of Musk. You don't know how that's going to work.
Yeah.
And how India is going to, get affected. I mean, essentially, he needs to articulate his Make in America sentiment with some country.
True.
So where that's going to go is again a different story. But I think overall, I think we are in, I would say, very positive position. And I think we should build on this. And I think that's why, I feel that the next 15, 20 years, whatever that we're talking about in these books,
Yeah.
these ideas will become a matter of global discussion.
Yeah.
Because 20, 30 years back or 50, 60 years back, when you consider snake charmers, no one really bothered about what we are.
Yeah.
Today, what we stand for, what our past stand for, is a reflection of what is right, what an aspiring superpower is doing, and what an aspiring superpower represents.
True.
And that is very different to 60, 70 years back. So these ideas, these, research, thoughts, our past, makes a very important contribution to the present and also the future.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, India has to play chess on a different level when it comes to United States, and be very vigilant. I think that's where it is. Sriram, before I let you go, one more question, maybe kind of a peekaboo into what's coming up next in the trilogy of your book series.
Yeah. So the third part deals with Viksit Bharat, right? So the major question which people keep asking me is, well, how is it relevant today? How is it relevant today? Right? So I provide a template in this new book on how some of these ideas, principles can be applied. Of course, I don't see wholesale changes, but I see a lot of marginal changes, marginal ideas. Basically, some of the things that I mentioned to you, aligning of policy to the way of life, how some of these things can be done in a practical way. Because I believe that, look, the 6 to 7% GDP, if you're going to grow at, say, 9-10% GDP, right, per annum, right? Yeah. This standard, first generation, second generation reforms will take you to, say, probably 8% GDP. Yeah. But beyond that, say, even judicial reforms, if you're able to do that, might take you a bit more. Correct. But in a sense, I feel the thrust that can really push is using this way of life and the entire informal sector's transition while we're going towards Viksit Bharat. And I think that's very important. So basically, this new book tries to give you a big picture of macro policy, and then tries to give you examples and concepts and ideas of how some of these principles can be applied. Absolutely. And of course, it's going to be contrarian and it's going to be, ruffle a few feathers, but that's the point of doing these things. So.
Absolutely. On that very, very positive note, Sriram, many, many thanks for being on this podcast, Sound of Money. All the very best, not for your upcoming book, but also for Hermenomics, which is making a lot of waves and being mentioned across the academic circles. All the very best to you. And well, let's stay connected on the Sound of Money.
Sure. Thank you, Santosh. Really enjoyed talking to you. Yeah.
Yes. And well, with that, we come to the end of this episode, super special episode coming in from Washington. My guest Sriram Subramaniam. Thanks for being, as always, on this podcast, The Sound of Money. From me, Santosh, and Sriram, have a good year ahead. Amazing 2025 has started, and we look forward to some amazing guests coming on my podcast. Bye-bye. Take care.
The Sound of Money with Santosh Sirur.